Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a long delayed video that's a follow-up to my previous one talking about James Tullos' How to World Build Fantasy Armies. This one is going to be focused on the barbarian and tribal aspect of it, and the reason it had to be made into its own video is that there's so much here that I think needs to be sort of talked about. Now, I want to get something out of the way that's very important. I happen to like James Tullos' channel and his content, and even this video. There's nothing strictly wrong with it, which is why this isn't a critique of his video per se. The reason I'm writing this is that I think that there are certain elements to fiction that can be elevated past the level that we're talking about here, because the way that he describes barbarian and tribal societies is how they're written in very popular, very good books, like The Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin. The Dothraki are written to a large extent the way that he presents them. And, of course, The Northmen from the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. These people are written very much in the way that James Tullos describes them as being. So I think that we can draw from reality and from history to end up with a much more nuanced, much more varied look at these sort of groups there. So first of all, let's define what barbarian and tribe sort of means there. And by that I mean we're not going to be able to. So barbarian etymologically means anybody that doesn't speak Greek. And this isn't really a useful terminology, but it's sort of the impression that sort of persists throughout it. It always sort of just means a group that is outside of your own culture, and often it's used to refer to them pejoratively as being inferior to you, especially once we get to the Roman period, where it's specifically directed at peoples from cultures that are meant to be in some way lesser than your own, or at least from the point of view of the writer. So barbarian doesn't really mean anything concrete, and as a result, you can end up with any sort of society being a barbarian society, so long as you view them as being culturally less significant than your own culture for some reason. But to strip things down a little bit more to what we would generally typify as being a barbarian society, it is usually going to be a sort of large collection of individual groups that are not necessarily part of a strong centralized state that's capable of organizing them on a broad sort of level, and that these individual groups will often engage in warfare against other people that are their neighbors. That's sort of how we view barbarians in a more modern sense there. And there are certain instances where groups would sort of fit that bill. I think that we can view the Vikings as being like that. The Germanic hordes were like that to a large extent. And there are a lot of different groups that sort of can be accurately described in that way. And that's generally speaking what we're thinking about. But even in that sort of context, there are a lot of different groups that you can end up having as barbarians. As an example, the Mongols, the Timurids, the Huns, those sort of groups all are also referred to as barbarians, but their method of fighting, their organization, and their structures are vastly different from the ones like the Gauls, who were much more heavily centralized. They had more advanced infrastructure. They had more disciplined armies than those groups. Well, not disciplined, that's the incorrect word, but they had much more infantry-focused shield wall type armies there. And then you have the very disorganized mobs like the Germanic armies there, like the Goths, the Suebi. Those sort of groups fought in very, very sort of disorganized patterns, and in the very archetypical sort of barbarian horde style. And later on, the Vikings also sort of typify this type of society where they would raid the coast of various different countries there. So barbarian, I think, can be used in various degrees of precision at different periods of time, but I think the most modern definition, which is the loosest, is actually the best in this instance, because it's evocative of what we were generally thinking of, and it's less culture specific. So if you're writing a fantasy setting, unless it's being set in a fantasy version of Greece, it doesn't make sense to use the original version of barbarian to refer to just anybody outside of the linguistic sphere that you're referring to. The next is the definition of tribal, and this is a little bit more precise, but it's still lacking as a term in my opinion. I've seen archaeological, sociological, anthropological definitions of it that vary tremendously in terms of how effective they are. Some of them would, for example, be that it's a small, geographically contained group of individuals who are bounded together by some direct bond of kinship, which means that they're sort of related by family. And this one doesn't really work super well, just because there are very, 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 very few groups that we would refer to as tribal that actually fit that definition. Very, very few of them actually are that close-knit, and this includes ones where the bonds of kinship mean that they've been taken into the tribal family, as it were. That doesn't mean that they're all sort of inbred or anything like that. But even accounting for that, very, very few tribes actually fit that bill, since they'll often have people who are captive, who don't really necessarily view themselves as being part of that kin group. You'll often have people who are there from some other sort of involuntary reasons, like they can't survive outside of the tribe. There are plenty of people who aren't really bounded by those sort of bonds, and they're more bonded by the practical reality of being in the tribe provides safety, security, and resources. So I don't think that that definition really fits very well, because there are very few tribal societies, if any, that actually fit that definition. And on the other end of the spectrum, you end up with the definition that it is a group of people who are connected by a common purpose, state, goal, anything that you can think of that sort of links them together as being a solid group of individuals. And unfortunately, this can be used to describe, like, Earth, if you really wanted to. And colloquially, there are people who would describe all of humanity under Earth as one tribe. And I get the symbolic sort of meaning behind that, but it's not necessarily that useful to us in a lot of instances. Generally speaking, what I use to refer to a tribe is that it is a community of individuals who are self-governing, that are not answerable or only limited degrees to the state at large, or are outside of any state aperture. So this is a sort of definition that I think is largely workable, but I don't necessarily know if it actually is entirely true. The reason that I sort of go with this definition is that it captures a lot of groups that I would want to consider tribal, and also allows for people to fall out of that classification much more effectively than sort of more colloquial terms. For example, you could look at the Lake Michigan tribal Americans. They would have been at one point considered just sort of tribal communities by that definition. But as they sort of came together and formed a larger, more cohesive state aperture and became the Haudenosaunee, they stopped being tribal. They became a federation of states. And I think that that ability to sort of fall out of that tribal classification, in spite of the fact that they still lived in much the same way, really represents the complexity and the sort of organization of their society better than the ones that rely on sort of a close-knit group. Because, again, like, are people from the Bronx a tribe? Like, they've got a very sort of close-knit community there, and they're kind of linked together by a bunch of different things. I don't think that that makes them a tribal society. It also covers groups in modern day, like Afghanistan, where you've got small, very rural groups that are sort of doing their farming, goat herding, whatever, and they largely act independent of the states because they're sort of outside of that apparatus there. It does cover that sort of thing as well. Now, there is the question of, is a city-state a tribe? I think that once it reaches a certain level of development and complexity, you can say that it's transformed into a city-state, where its government is concentrated enough that it is as though it were a larger state apparatus concentrated into one small city. But the boundary between when the two would happen is very, very fuzzy, and I don't think that there's any strict way to say that that happens. But that is kind of how things work over time, where you'd have individual tribes setting up in a specific location, becoming these more advanced kingdoms or city-states, evolving from those tribes that had originally settled there. I think that that is a necessary part of the definition of what a tribe can be. So that's how I'm viewing tribes, and that's how I'm viewing barbarians. So the next thing that we want to talk about is how these armies got their recruits. Now, there's multiple different ways, but ultimately the most concise way of putting it is that barbarian and tribal societies have the exact same considerations to think about when they're forming their armies as stated armies do. So this means that you're going to see models that are akin to a militia or to a professional force. And this is going to vary depending on sort of the culture and the situation that these people find themselves in. you could find instances where every single individual is armed quite heavily and they're expected to be able to defend themselves and their homes and the people around them. Or you could have groups where a small core are these elite warriors as a professional force, and they only drop the rest of the population under emergency circumstances. What you won't see from a barbarian or tribal society is the sort of level of professional army where you'd never have to muster your civil population. And realistically speaking, only very, very, very few states were able to get away with this throughout history, the Romans being a common example of that. The majority of instances, you're going to see most factions or nations or groups forced to recruit their population in times of crisis so that they're capable of getting enough recruits into the army so that they're capable of fighting. And by definition, tribal and barbarian societies are sort of smaller, isolated groups. So if they find themselves in conflict, they're much more likely to need that extra manpower that they're going to be able to draw up upon. So you're rarely going to find ones that completely disregard any sort of militia in favor of a completely professional army. That's simply not going to be an option for them, but that holds true for the majority of antiquity as well, where the majority of the population could be mustered during a time of war or crisis. So the recruits for these armies are going to largely be the same sort of recruits that you're going to get from any other sort of nation. Now, there are certain exceptions to this, and there are a couple interesting ones. The Mongol Hordes, for example, are again an interesting exception, but it also applies to things like the Huns, the Timurids. These groups are largely hunters in the sort of steppes and arid areas of the world where you can't easily farm very well. So there aren't going to be individuals who spend their time farming or doing sedentary types of work. You're going to have these large nomadic groups always on the move looking for things that they can hunt. And the method that they would use, which is horseback archery, translates really, really, really well to warfare. And as a result of this, every single individual is constantly drilling and training in the art of warfare, making the entire Mongol army functionally a professional army, even though what they're doing to do that training to become a professional army is hunting. So you end up in this sort of situation where you could say that the entirety of the Mongol horde is a professional army, or you could say that it's really that they're not a professional army the majority of the time, and they're really doing, air quotes, farming, and only the Keshiks and the other heavy cavalry are actually sort of full-time soldiers. So I do think it's worthwhile noting that they sort of hinge on that sort of idea that their entire population is essentially mobilized in a way that's similar to a professional army. The next one is going to be how the armies are sort of armed once they've been recruited. Now, James Tullos writes that they are sort of just taking whatever weapons they have at hand and sort of going in a big blob and sort of running at the enemy there. And this is partially true, and this is partially not true. Armaments are going to be, to a large extent, procured on an individual basis, or they might be provided by somebody else to a poor person. But there are going to be certain levels of standardization of what people are expected to have. Some instances would be everyone's required to have certain types of weaponry for their work. For example, again, the Mongols with their composite bows require those composite bows to do their job, so everyone is going to have a composite bow when they're at war as well. Other groups, you're going to often find that people who are not well trained are required to get things like spears and shields and some kind of armor or helm. And this means that there's a level of standardization and that everyone's going to have certain baseline types of equipment under normal circumstances, but the type of spear, the way the spear is built, the way the shield is built, are going to have some variance to it. Now, since they're all from one small village, you're probably going to get very similar spears because the person who makes them, everyone probably goes to the same person to get their spear made. Everyone probably goes to the same person to get their shield made. So there's going to be some level of just standardization by default because of that. But everyone, largely speaking, is going to have relatively similar types of weapons. It's not complete pandemonium as far as self-equipment goes. Now, the other thing that's going to be important is that there are going to be wealthier individuals within those communities. Those are the ones where they're going to have much more variance in terms of individual armaments because they can afford to have whatever sort of they want to. But for the most part, you're going to be seeing these groups relatively homogeneously armed compared to sort of the idea that everyone's sort of just coming in with maybe a kitchen knife or pitchfork or something like that. Quite often they would be equipped with some inexpensive form of armament that would be relatively required by them by whoever's organizing the war group. Next up would be the army organization itself, and this sort of requires us to know a little bit about their weapons as well. So James Tullos and a lot of people depict barbarians as having sort of no force organization. They don't have any sort of standard regiment size or groupings or squad or command structure. And this largely isn't true. Most of the time you're going to have individual groups formed either sort of on an ad hoc basis of these are people who sort of all work together and know one another, they've trained together, so they're going to form a group. Or you could have people subdivided in groups of tens. This is a very, very common kind of organization for more sort of basic armies where it's easy to cluster people in groups of 10, have one person in charge of that group of 10, have those group of 10s form 10 groups of 10 for 100 people, them with their own leader. This is just a really simplistic, not necessarily optimized way of organizing a force, and it is common in these sort of tribal or barbarian societies when they're forming larger armies. And as a result, you do end up with some forms of organization with forces across these different groups there. Now, for very, very, very small engagements and very small groups, you're not going to have that sort of organization. It's going to just be basically like a small hunting party acting in the same sort of organization that they would for hunting. This might be very common amongst, for example, tribes in, say, Brazil, in the Amazon rainforest, where you're not going to see large sweeping armies traveling through the Amazon rainforest. It just doesn't work that effectively, and you're instead going to see small skirmishing groups getting into small-scale conflict against invaders. Or you might just see honor-based combat, where it's mostly to intimidate the other side into capitulating against another tribal group. So you're not going to see that level of cohesion and organization because it's not warranted at that scale of warfare. But when they do come together to form large coalitions against a larger threat, that's when you are going to see that divisions by 10 sort of aspect, or you're going to see them dividing up by individual commanders, bringing together their own personal force and then commanding it, and other individual commanders. It's going to vary depending on time, situation, and need of those peoples there. The other thing about the organization of these armies is that they are going to have to organize in some level. It's impossible to have an army where everything is just melded together, and no matter how disorganized your army is. Take, for example, having your infantry in their sort of shield wall formation and then having archers. You can't just mix the archers into the shield wall because they sort of degrade the effectiveness of the shield wall formation by being in there. They create gaps in the shield wall that projectiles can enter in through weak points in the line that the enemy can push through. And similarly, the shield wall and all the spearmen sort of around them are going to block the ability of those archers to fire their bows. They're going to limit the movement of their arms so they can't stretch the bowstring back as easily. They're going to get in the way of the arrow as it flies through because it's going to have to weave through all of those spear points that are sort of being held up above them. So you can't mix those two types of groups together. You have to have the archers either sort of behind the line or in front of it and then fleeing behind it after the time comes, or on the wings there or something, keeping their line of sight clear to the enemy and making it so that they're capable of firing their shots without getting in the way of other people. And similarly, you can't have cavalry mixed in with either of these two groups. The horses would get skittish around the spears that are being held by the infantry, and there's that real possibility that some infantrymen get kicked or trampled by the horses as they're sort of scampering about. So you can't mix the cavalry in with the infantry, and similarly you don't want them mixed in with the archers for similar sorts of reasons. They'd get in the way of the archers firing effectively, they might kick one of the archers. It requires that you have, at the very, very least, no matter how badly organized your army is, separated cavalry, infantry, and ranged units. Now, the irony here is that you can actually have armies that combine these into single formations, but doing so actually requires better drill, discipline, and coordination than the opposite. It's much easier to have all infantry with melee weapons in one block, all ranged units in another block, and all cavalry in another block. We didn't really get a true combined approach where we got the effectiveness of cavalry, a ranged unit, and a close range unit all together up until modern combined arms warfare, where you would have an armored personnel carrier acting as cavalry, capable of adding a bit of punch and sort of durability to the unit as well as breakthrough. You've got the infantry equipped with the machine gun, capable of denying an area just like a spear or a pike would. You've got the marksman's rifle, capable of engaging targets over long distance, and a variety of other weapons that sort of fill in between roles with that sort of grouping. That's a very modern concept. Being able to combine all of those different elements into a single unit requires a lot of technology, discipline, and drill. Whereas in antiquity, you're only ever really going to see at most infantry with melee weapons, sometimes having something they can throw at the enemy before they engage in melee combat. That's about as close to integrated combined arms within a single formation that you're going to get. So the army organization being sort of divided in this sort of primitive way isn't really a limitation of them. It's just a limitation of the time period that you're looking at, and getting anything past there is going to be a little bit difficult. So this brings us to tactics, and this is going to be tremendously varied based on the types of weapons and equipment and resources that are available to a tribe or a barbarian society, as well as the types of terrain that they expect to find themselves on. You're not going to see a very successful Mongol horde rampaging their way through the Amazon basin, nor are you going to see them successfully fighting their way across the beaches, as they did, one time try. That type of cavalry mobile warfare simply doesn't work in those types of terrain. You need to have different types of armies to engage in combat in those sort of situations. And by a similar sort of notice, if you take a large group of infantry like you would from Germania and have them sort of fight their way across the open plains, they're going to get surrounded and completely cut down by cavalry, which is going to be a major concern for them. So where you're fighting and what sort of terrain you're expecting your barbarian horde to be engaging in matters a lot. You're going to find that what type of setting you've created and what sort of geography you've given your barbarians is going to really influence how they look and how they fight and how they appear. This is something that I think does work well in sort of fantasy fiction. You do tend to see a little bit of variety as far as that goes. But what you don't tend to see are the ones where it's tribal or barbarian societies from extremely dense terrain, which tend to engage in a much more guerrilla warfare style of engagement, rather than sort of sweeping in and destroying civilization. And there are a couple of different reasons for that, but generally speaking, you're going to have a lot of variety of tactics in these sort of groups there. Now, very simple tactics when we were talking about a very basic type of army, one where it's infantry center, cavalry on the wings, archers to the front. This is a very classical type of army, and it's one that barbarians can and would use to a certain extent there. This is done for a very particular reason, and that is that communications and organization across an army for large, complex tactical maneuvers is actually really, really hard up until the invention of the radio. So much so that even by the time we're looking at the American Civil War, we're seeing battalions that are out of position and being destroyed because they've gone too far by a little bit compared to what the general wanted, or they're not pushing an objective when they're supposed to be, or they've moved to the wrong position, forcing other generals to move their armies up in ways that they don't want to. All of this is because communication is actually ridiculously hard across very, very long distances. So the tactics are going to be restricted in that sort of way. Now, this was even true for the Romans, which is why you often see from the Romans heavy infantry in the center, skirmishers to the front, and cavalry out in the wings. And the reason that you're doing this is that all of that force is concentrated in a relatively small area that's capable of communicating with the general relatively effectively. Doing large flanking maneuvers is quite difficult. Having a detachment go and do its own thing is a little bit risky and relies on you having a very good sub-general. If you've got good sub-generals, you can get away with that kind of thing. But that applies to both the stated armies and to the barbarians and tribal societies. If you've got multiple really good effective generals, have one lead a detachment off to the side that's capable of sweeping in from the sides and encircling the enemy. That works just as well for barbarians as it does for large states. And you, on the other end of the spectrum, you can get these very, very elaborate, complex tactics if you've got armies that are drilled to do those things. And again, we turn to the Mongol Hordes here. Their style of fighting was sort of built up from their training of hunting things. And one thing that they trained to do was to encircle an enemy across a very, very large area, using their mobility and their speed to their advantage, circling around the opponent, not getting sort of into a conclusive engagement, forcing your opponent to sort of cluster together until you're capable of causing that entire group that you've encircled to either capitulate or to be crushed by your cavalry charges and your arrow fire. This is something that requires tremendous coordination across very, very, very large distances, because we're talking about cavalry coming in from all sides against your army there, picking off and isolating smaller groups, encircling them and crushing the individual groups there, doing feigned flights, coming back into the fight when they need to. All of that requires a lot of complex coordination that they got from constant drill and practice. And that's sort of what lets you get away with these sort of tactics on that sort of scale. But they're kind of an exception because, again, they're capable of doing essentially daily drill by training constantly on how to hunt with their bow and their horse. In other situations, it is fair to say that their tactics are going to be limited, but they're not limited any more than the tactics of most feudal-type kingdoms. Most barbarian tactics are going to be very, very reminiscent of what we would expect to see from those types of kingdoms there. As a result, I don't think that there's any reason to sort of say that they're vastly inferior to most of them. It's just that a lot of people like to sort of compare barbarians to Rome, and Rome, similarly to the Mongols, drilled constantly. They had a lot of generals. They had a lot of sub-commanders that were quite competent. They practiced their formation movements and their tactical movement very, very rigorously, allowing them to do more complex maneuvers than other armies. This is a matter of practice when you don't have good communication, and constant drilling is something that is rare even in professional armies in large states. So, having talked about tactics, let's talk a little bit about logistics. So logistics is going to be one where barbarians and tribal societies kind of don't really think about it often. Usually they're going to be fighting very close to their borders, doing raids into enemy territory where they don't need to worry about supply or logistics. If you're doing those sorts of engagements and you're not trying to push deep into enemy territory, which they often didn't, then the supply and logistics side of things isn't really a concern for you. Fighting a campaign in your own terrain as well is one where you've got a lay of the land, you know where the good forageables are, you've got stores within your own villages and communities that you can rely on. So the logistics element for a lot of these campaigns just isn't necessary. But let's take a look at other groups that maybe did have campaigns further abroad, and that would be the Scandinavians. Now, their logistics were actually fairly complicated because they were capable of bringing in supplies by boat. Their longships were capable of navigating shallow rivers, and they were able to bring supplies as a result of that with them on long journeys. And the complexity of that is actually it's actually really basic to do this way, but it's so simplistic to use water to your advantage for bringing supplies that even a barbarian or tribal society is going to be fully capable of utilizing that sort of resource. And they often would, and they often did. This is what allowed the Vikings to sort of travel and raid and pillage or trade across massive amounts of Europe. You'll find stories of them going as far as Constantinople, where they were hired as the Varangian guards. This was something that they were capable of doing because of their longships and because of their ability to sort of navigate rivers using their shipping. And so the results of logistics are going to be based on what it is a group of individuals is doing. The reason that the Vikings had to go so far abroad to go raiding and pillaging and doing stuff like that is because there's nothing worth raiding or pillaging in the area right by Scandinavia. So if you set off sail to England and go sack Lindisfarne, you're getting a lot more return out of your value by traveling that long distance across by boat, instead of just going over to your neighbor and beating up some Danes or something like that. It's not really that lucrative to do that at that time. So the logistics really comes from need and necessity. The Romans had very complicated logistics because they needed it. They were doing these long pushes and campaigns that lasted years and years and years, deep in enemy territory. So they were going to require that. But the majority of armies, the majority of the time, are going to be fighting much closer to their own home, and as a result need much less complicated logistics. So especially for barbarians who are engaging in things like raids into civilized territory and stuff like that. For tribal societies, it's very similar. You're often going to find them fighting in much more local concerns, and that's because of the scope and scale of what a tribal society really is. they're not going to have a big picture view of things because they can't really influence the bigger picture. They're small and relatively weak individually as a tribe, incapable of sort of defeating larger nations or states. And as a result of that, they kind of can only deal with concerns in their own local borders. I think that for the most part, you can gloss over logistics unless you have some sort of strange event where barbarians are taking over the world. Now, the group of barbarians that did take over the world was, again, the Mongols, and their logistics came from the fact that their horses were their logistics. They were limited by the grass that they found, and there's some historians that say that the Mongols stopped their push westward because they ran out of arable land that they could use to graze their horses on. So the logistics for them was very, very different than what we would classically view as being logistics, but it still existed for them. Having groups, though, that are primarily nomadic horse peoples, you can get away with having very, very long, complex logistical routes as a result of that, because they bring the entirety of their productive capacity in agriculture with them, essentially, making it so that logistics just really isn't something they have to think about in the classical sense there. So that brings us to sort of the last little bits here. There's certain elements to his video that we don't really need to talk about because he doesn't elaborate too much on sort of barbarian and tribal sort of uses of magic being specific, or their sort of fortifications and things like that, although those did exist. But this brings us to the armaments and armor that are used by these sort of groups here. And again, you're looking at something where the complexity and quality of this could be incredibly varied. You could end up with people who only are capable of really producing like blowpipes with poison-tipped darts, or you could be looking at people in full scale armor with iron helm and a longsword as a fairly standard type of thing being worn by a warrior of that sort of barbarian group or that tribe. It really matters just which sort of part of the world you're looking at, because the thing about tribal societies and barbarians is that there is always cultural diffusion, and there's also always innovation within these groups, because these groups are going to look at things that their enemies have and they're going to say, that's really effective, I want it, and they're going to get it. That's generally speaking how that worked. The degree to which it's capable of replicating stuff from the more advanced societies can vary. Sometimes it's actually more powerful and more effective than the ones used by their neighbors. Roman gladiuses, for example, are not necessarily the best swords. They're just really easy to mass manufacture. They're easy to train in. They're good at causing people to stab with them intuitively instead of to slash, which is a better maneuver. But there are people in the what would be considered barbarian tribes who were better swordsmiths than the Romans, who made better weapons. Their armor being made out of chainmail was perfectly serviceable and comparable to the majority of what the Romans would wear, since we know that the that sort of segmented plate armor that a lot of Romans are depicted as was actually extremely rare. Most of them wore either scale armor or chainmail, which were similarly competitive to what the barbarians would be wearing, because that would be the same sort of thing. So the types of weapons and equipment that a barbarian group is going to have is usually going to just be whatever the local hegemonic power is using. The only difference is going to be a scale of wealth. If we were to look at a lot of the Germanic hordes or the Gaelic tribes or the Picts, the Iceni, the Scots, these individuals could make Roman-style weapons and Roman-style armor, but all of those were very expensive. So you're going to find that only the best warriors are armed in chainmail with a sword and with a shield, whereas every single Roman soldier is armed that way. As a result of this, the majority of them should only be differentiated in terms of their equipment compared to their more civilized counterparts by the number of soldiers who are sort of wearing that top-of-the-line equipment. If you're looking at a situation in a different part of the world where a tribal society has no contact with a more advanced society, you're often going to see much, much, much more primitive weapons. And the reason for that is that there's none of that sort of competition with more powerful weapons, forcing them to either innovate or to steal weapon technology from their opponents. And as a result, you can get away with groups that are in incredibly isolated parts of the world using these sort of very primitive weapons for extremely long periods of time without ever having to need more advanced types of weapons or armor, because strictly speaking, they won't need to invent those. And as a result of this, the weapons and armor that are being used by your barbarian or tribal societies, it could be really anything. The only difference is that you're going to want to make sure that the more centralized state, the wealthier, more culturally, more urbanized sort of areas, have more expensive weapons, more expensive armor, are capable of funding armies that are capable of using that more expensive equipment effectively. That's really sort of the primary distinction in terms of what weapons are available to both of these groups. Now, I do think that a good way to sort of depict that is that the majority of the people are going to have either padded or cloth armor or something like that. They might have just parts of chain, or they might have brigandine or something like that. Anything that's sort of a little bit easier to manufacture with limited resources would be more common for these individuals. And weapons as well would be mostly things that would be useful for a variety of things, or they're cheap to manufacture, like spears. Now, moving from there to cavalry. Cavalry is another situation where barbarian and tribal societies are going to have access to this entirely based on what sort of environment they live in and what's sort of around them. If you're in an area where there's lots of horses and that's something that you want to be able to sort of write about, then they're going to have lots of horses. If they're in a place where there's no horses, then they're not going to have any horses. It's really simple as that. But what is different about these sort of tribal groups is the way they use cavalry. Generally speaking, shock cavalry is relatively rare in these sort of societies. There were shock cavalry in a lot of them in some capacity, but it would often be very few, and it would often not be sort of dedicated shock cavalry. They might have other roles on the battlefield. The reasons for this are pretty complicated, and I'm not entirely sure that I know all of them. It could just be that these sort of tribal groups, like, say, the Mongols, the Scythians, although the Scythians weren't barbarians, if you look at, like, the Mongols, the Huns, or even if you look at, like, the Germanic armies and stuff like that, or the Gauls, these groups would fire arrows from horseback, or they'd fight in limited engagements, or they'd be used to scare off skirmishers. They wouldn't charge straight into the front of heavy infantry to try and shatter them, like you might see from feudal knights from European armies. And it's difficult to say exactly what you need to have that done, but there appear to be a lot of technological innovations that are required for someone with a heavy lance to bear down on infantry successfully, and it seems that they're less likely to crop up in those types of states. It could be that you needed to have better armor for the horse itself, as well as better armor for the knight. That's possible, but the heavy cataphracts didn't really have heavily armored horses necessarily. They had partially armored horses, and the armor on the men was the same as what you saw from other countries at the time. So why this is not something I'm entirely confident I can say with certainty, but generally speaking, you're going to find that skirmishing is a much more common tactic amongst tribal societies and with barbarian sort of armies there. This includes when you do a sort of quick raid with cavalry. They sort of just ride right past people very close range and just loose an arrow from point blank range. That would still be hitting and running because you're not intending to sort of stick around and then get in a protracted fight. Now, against enemies that are sort of shattering, you might send in cavalry to sort of pick off fleeing members, or you might use them to smash into a group of light archers or something of the sort. Tribal societies and other groups would still do those sorts of engagements, but broadly speaking, you're just not going to see those same nightly charges out of these groups. So anyway, that's the majority of what James Tullos talks about in terms of barbarians and tribal societies. There's a little bit I could talk about in terms of fortification, but realistically all we have to say is that the tribes and barbarians did fortify their settlements when they needed to. That's something they're capable of doing, whether it be large full-walled settlements like what you would expect from the Gauls, or I guess the Maori aren't really considered tribal. They're often considered a kingdom, but they would have very extensive fortifications. Groups like that, they're capable of building whatever fortifications usually are needed. You generally see more wood and earthwork rather than solid stone, but that's merely a matter of industrial scale and what's available and what's readily accessible. So In any event, yeah, that's my whole video on barbarians and tribal societies in terms of fantasy world building. The real takeaway that I want you to have from this is that there's no sort of specific type that you have to aim for when you're creating a barbarian or tribal society. You can create a lot of depth and complexity. Just always be mindful of where that society is coming from and where they are. Where they are dictates what their armies look like, and what the terrain is like is going to dictate how they fight. And I think to a large extent that's really the takeaway there. Another thing I think that you want to take away from this is that barbarian and tribal armies are usually going to be more similar to professional stated armies than I think people give them credit for being, with the only limitations being based around the wealth and population of a large state compared to those barbarians or tribal groups. But population even is often tilted in favor of the barbarians in a lot of fiction, just because it's large groups of people coming together from many, many different tribes and many different groups across a very large area. So anyway, that's my phone telling me that this video has gone on long enough. So in any event, I hope you found this video enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you guys all next time.